They feel the tariff trade war would help U.S. economy.
I'm not favoring Trump economic policies of tariffs. But Trump, there's no doubt about it, Trump thinks tariffs are a tool.
To weaken China.
Well, or maybe negotiate with China.
United States started all of this. Now it's trying to withdraw from a lot of international. I remember the President Hoover. He waged trade war back in last century 30s. Brought the United States into a disaster.
If we all try to close down at once, then you go back to the 30s. That's not good for anybody. He wanted to try and negotiate a purchasing deal with China. I don't think that will make the fundamental change, but that may be the nature of his politics. Trump is now hyperactive. He's challenging, and we'll see how that turns out.
Hello, Bob. It's an honor to have met you here in China.
So first, Boming, thank you for hosting me. I know very much of your record and the many interviews you've done and your knowledge across countries, so it's a real pleasure to be with you.
I know that you have just published your book, America in the World. In the book, you have sort of outlined the U.S. Foreign policy since the founding of the United States. I think for quite a long time, the United States became the biggest economy back in 1890. United States become the only hegemon in the world, I mean, superpower. So that has lasted for quite a few decades until recently when President Trump became the president. Why is that President Trump withdrew from international affairs?
So, as you say, President Trump believes that the alliances and the international economic system that the United States helped create and worked to integrate China into with the WTO and the World Bank and the IMF, he believes that disadvantaged the United States. Now, actually, if you look at the facts, the United States was about 25% of the world's economy in 1970, and it's still 25%, even with the growth of China. So I don't agree with his assessment, but I think what he's reflecting, as you pointed out, is changes in popular mood. We had long, expensive wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and people were tired of those. So if you see, he wants to avoid wars and conflicts. He's trying to settle peace in Ukraine and Middle East. We'll see how effective he is, but nevertheless, that's his focus. You had the global financial crisis. You had the pandemic. When China came into the world economy, it became the workplace of the world. So the U.S. was advantaged with low-priced goods, but it also created what some economists call a China shock, the effect of people loss of jobs. So it's inevitable, and you will encounter this in China too, that at points of great change, it makes people anxious. You have to help people adapt to change. Now, Trump's approach is to try to raise barriers and cut different deals. That wouldn't be my preference. My preference is to try to adapt the international system. So let's take the case of the U.S. and China. The U.S. has a big trade deficit with China. But bilateral trade deficits can be very misleading because the U.S. has a trade surplus with Australia, Australia has a trade surplus with China, China has a surplus with the United States. I think the more fundamental issue deals with the topic of imbalances. So China now relies heavily on investment and infrastructure and exports for demand as opposed to consumption. The U.S. relies more on consumption than it does the other topics. And so I would deal with that topic more by trying to rebalance the internal demands of the different countries. Trump's idea is to put tariffs on.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
And as he did before, we'll see what happens now, he wanted to try and negotiate a purchasing deal with China. I don't think that will make the fundamental change, but that may be the nature of his politics. So I think this is a time of testing for Trump. We'll see whether these tariffs actually create inflation. As you've seen in recent week, the stock market is a little uncertain where this is going to go. It's a good example, the underlying changes in the international and domestic environment creating political pressure. Now, for Trump, it's also other issues, and you can see he's focusing on that. I think they were very troubled by inflation. And then the third was I don't know how this would translate into Chinese, but it was called the woke agenda, the idea of disparate groups trying to advantage one group over the other. And so those, I think, were the three political forces. But with the election, Trump is now hyperactive. He's challenging, and we'll see how that turns out.
After the World War, II, the United States, basically after the downfall of the Soviet Union, United States probably is the only one that's taking care of international affairs. So it's a unipolar system in the international order. Before that, multipolar system. So how do you compare with the two? Which one that will make the world more stable?
I think one has to also distinguish security from economics. So in the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union were the dominant bipolar security powers.
Yeah.
But I would have felt the world economy moved towards multipolarity in economics much earlier. Recovery of Japan, recovery of Europe, and then, of course, the big story being Chinese reforms and opening up playing a key role.
Yeah.
Now, after the end of the Cold War, the United States sought to maintain the alliance system for stability. But again, in economic terms, I think it was always multipolar, and China's a good example of this. So I gave a speech when I was at the State Department in 2005, where I urged China to become a responsible stakeholder, was the phrase. And the logic of that was that for 30 years, the U.S. policy had been to try to integrate opening China into the international system. By 2005, China was a member of the UN Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. It was part of international environmental agreements. And so what I was suggesting in 2005 was that because of China's accomplishments, the international system had helped China, but now China also needed to try to support.
Especially after WTO.
Yes, but and then that system was one that China had an interest in. But the system would have to adapt, and China would also have a role in that adaptation. Instead, the system moved more towards great power competition than a systemic one. So in a sense, there can be different models, but one also has to recognize that the system will change. For example, China of 2025 is very different than the China of 1970. My own view is sometimes people say globalization is in retreat. I don't think that's accurate if you look at capital flows and climate and oceans and biological security. But the governance of globalization has fragmented and created frictions.
President Trump could be an exceptional case. I'm asking if those underlying principles are still there. I mean, the U.S. working with European allies and to maintain the world order. So it might be, let's say, after 4 years, after President Trump, then the U.S. policy would swing back.
It's a possibility, but I think when Trump was reelected, it underscored that the disruptive nature of his policies. So let's take a couple of your examples. He believes that the European countries didn't pay enough for their defense. And so he has said NATO is protecting them, but not good enough for us. And over the past weeks, you've seen Germany and other Europeans said they'll pay more. That could go one of two ways. One is it could say, well, this is more fair, and it would support a future NATO. Or it could create a sense that Europe can't rely on the United States.
So they are going their own way.
Could be. So, and let's take the Asia context. As you know, because you've studied international affairs, in the 60s, there was a view that many more states would become nuclear powers. Because the United States provided a security umbrella, many countries did not develop nuclear weapons. But if, for example, the United States security commitment to South Korea is no longer reliable, 70% of the people in Korea want to have a nuclear weapon. If South Korea gets a nuclear weapon, and Russia and North Korea and China have nuclear weapons, what might happen in Tokyo? So the point is that, as your question suggests, this is a time of upheaval in the international system. The pendulum may swing back on some of these topics, but I think we're moving into an era now that is likely to be more like the great powers of 1900. The US, China, India, Russia militarily, not necessarily economically. Europe will determine whether it'll be more cohesive. This creates dangers about tensions between those powers.
Yeah.
So the post-World War II system that the U.S. created wasn't always perfect. The U.S. made mistakes in Vietnam and in other areas, but it created a certain stability and economic opportunity. Trump is now going in a different direction. So in that sense, the history is useful to help you think of questions to ask. History doesn't move in a straight line. There's often cycles. Yeah?
Since you talk about this trade war, there was an example in your book. I remember the President Hoover. He waged a trade war back in last century 30s, brought the United States into a disaster. But there were plenty of examples that trade war would not help anybody. They feel the tariff trade war would help U.S. economy.
What you are underscoring is people have different historical reference points. So as you properly mentioned, there was a tariff act of 1930, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, that raised the average U.S. tariff to 59%.
Wow.
And it was a disaster. Now, the U.S. had a trade surplus, so if you want to have a trade surplus, we had a trade surplus, but we also had unemployment of 25%.
Yeah.
And it contributed to the collapse of the international system in the 30s, and whether it was Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and the breakdown of the international security order. For many years, Americans had that as their reference point, just as you were saying. But I think for more recent generations, they've had other reference points. So for example, after World War II, the early 1970s, the United States was by far the most dominant economy. But as Europe came back, as Japan came back, in the 1970s, you remember, we had the energy price shocks. And so many of the traditional industries was called the Rust Belt. They struggled. Right? And so I think part of the issue is that people have more recent reference points about the dangers, as they saw it, of the economic disruption of the 70s and 80s. Then this is where the issue of China comes in. As China grows in the international economy, it becomes a larger force. And for some people, farmers, this was good. They were selling more to China. But for others in the lower end manufacturing, it was hard. So now there's another reference point. So your point is really important in that in dealing with politics of these issues, it's important to have a sense of what's the historical reference point. So let me try to apply this in China's case. The amazing thing about China is that people within their own lifespan will have seen this amazing increase in terms of living standards. But as China's economy slows, then people may become less certain. My guess is, even though living standards are much better, there's an uncertainty created because people are now worried, well, do they have to save for their elderly parents? Can they afford to have a child and work? So in a way, whether it's the US or Japan or others, some of these phenomena, I think, will also affect China. For a while, people will say, this system helped us grow and change our life. But as it slows down, you'll have to deal with the politics of those issues.
What's in his mind, the logic, he is trying to make U.S. Great again. By doing that, by raising taxes, not to China, I mean, to everybody. I mean, his neighbors, I mean, Canada, Mexico, all of that. Probably next time he's going to do it to Europe, I mean.
And so, again, I'm not favoring these Trump economic policies of tariffs. But Trump, there's no doubt about it, Trump thinks tariffs are a tool. He's using these tariffs with fentanyl or other issues that he wants to
weaken China, I mean, in terms
or
of
maybe negotiate with China.
I have other set of numbers. I mean, U.S. Used to have Oliver-shaped society structure. Very good, big middle class guys. But after these 20, 30 years, now it's a pyramid with a very small number, like 5 to 10% of people owning the whole wealth of like 70, 80%. And the middle class guys, I mean, they don't have wage increase or wealth increase for some 20, 30 years. That's what I heard from your economists. We're sort of being taken advantage of. Is that true?
That is the anxiety and mood that President Trump was taking advantage of politically. The sense of upheaval. I personally think the story is somewhat different. If you look at living standards in the United States, you've actually tended to see is if you divide incomes into quintiles, into 5 parts, the middle one has tended to move up. The top one has done a lot better because of financial assets.
Okay.
So with all the monetary policies, stock markets have gone up. And so if you own financial assets, you're a lot richer. If you don't, haven't had the benefit of that. The bottom fifth has also actually moved up, but the fourth group, I think in some ways is the one that is frustrated because the bottom group is now moving up with it, but the fourth group is not moving up. So these are people that perhaps had less education, less training, maybe single parents, drug use, which is one of the other things that Trump is sort of focusing on, health problems. So you're right that a society has to take care of all of its people, but my own view is that by raising barriers, by making goods more costly, you're not going to help those people.
I was alarmed, by a conference a few years ago that Professor Stiglitz, he said, globalization is really overstated. We ought to be careful that globalization. United States started all of this. And now it's United States trying to withdraw from a lot of international. So what happened?
Globalization helped China move hundreds of millions of people from poverty. I first visited China in 1980, fellowship in Hong Kong. I was only in China for a day, but it was a very strong picture in my memory because I visited a communal farm, I visited a city of low concrete blocks. Everybody wore blue and gray, unlike now. It was very poor. So I think globalization helped many countries improve their income.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And there were benefits for the U.S. too. So not only lower prices, after China came into the WTO, it was the fastest growing export market for the U.S. for 15 years. But then it's the question of if you have rapid change, whether due to trade or technology, how do you help people adapt? So in 1900, 40% of American workers were farmers.
Okay.
Today, 1 to 2%, but they're about 3 times more productive.
Okay.
So what happens to the farmers? Well, first they go to manufacturing. Eventually, as you said, China moved to low-end manufacturing. The U.S. actually remained quite a productive manufacturing power, but at the higher end.
Yeah.
With more productivity, wages are higher, but there are fewer workers. Then people move to the service sector. And so that transition is difficult for people. China is facing this today.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the point is you have to help people adapt to change. But going back to globalization, I don't see any other way in which you deal with the international economy or climate or pandemics and biological security unless you have some form of cooperation. So I was at the World Bank during the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
China and the U.S. had the biggest stimulus programs, and that was very important for the world economy. So what I'd say to Mr. Stiglitz or Professor Stiglitz and others is, when I encounter people in the developing world, they don't want to shut down globalization. They want to be able to trade. They want to be able to increase their income.
Yes.
So let me give you one other example that I find interesting. The working age labor force in sub-Saharan Africa is now, within a year or two, will be bigger than the working age labor force in all of developed countries. And within a couple more years, it'll be bigger than China's labor force. So are you going to help those people have better incomes, or are they going to migrate? And if they migrate, what happens to stability? So the challenge is we have national governments, but you still have a global order. My belief is more open trade, lower barriers, openness of ideas and people, that's a plus. My view of that is always that while you have differences, that we should try to manage those and try to find the ground of cooperation. But I'm in a minority today.
Oh, okay. Let's say U.S. economy. Hedge fund guy, Ray Dalio, the Bridgewater. I just saw an interview with him. He's warning the United States to sort of debt level, is that sustainable? The interest payment, the service, this debt, is roughly the same as your defense. I was really surprised to see that, or next to your Medicare. How do you see this thing, I mean, the U.S. debt level?
So there was a U.S. economist many years ago named Herb Stein, and he said, if something cannot continue, it will stop. But I share the view that I think this is one of the problems of the past administrations. If you look at U.S. debt levels, they were manageable even with the wars in the early 2000s. But the combination of the global financial crisis and then the pandemic. So our debt as a percentage of GDP is now about 99%. It was the post-World War II high in peacetime was about 104%. So you're getting near the post-time high.
Oh.
The deficit is 5 to 6% of GDP. Even though growth is pretty good, I think that the U.S. need to discipline the spending and to deal with the deficit is a very important point for the future. This can be done. It was done in the 90s. And we actually had a surplus for a time.
I still remember the time of, I still remember the TV. When President Clinton, the first time, a surplus, there was only happened in his term, I mean, a surplus.
But so I think, to put this in context, what we saw in many countries, in Europe, the United States, China, is that the combination of the global financial crisis and the pandemic led to extraordinary monetary policies and extraordinary fiscal policies. And another way of describing what you are analyzing is that I think we're moving out of that now. And I think this goes to the point about international equilibrium and growth in the system. And so I think how countries adjust to this and how they adjust while others are adjusting will be very important. Now, and so on a positive note, look, Germany, as you know, has been very restrictive in terms of spending. But all of a sudden in the past couple of weeks now, the new Chancellor Merz, is going to negotiate an end to their restriction for both defense spending and for infrastructure. This may help the European economy. That will help global growth.
Okay.
In the case of China, I think one of the challenges has been China had a very big stimulus program in the financial crisis. Or if you want to help the local or provincial governments with real estate or with bad loans, how do you balance that without putting added tax burden? I think this is where there's a risk in the international system. So at heart, as you know, there's a difference between the macroeconomic policies of fiscal and monetary and the structural policies for growth. And I tend to focus on the structural policies for growth, which, by the way, are often associated with open trading systems. If we all try to close down at once, then you go back to the 30s. That's not good for anybody. You know, one of the things that President Trump talks about is reducing spending, but unless he goes at the entitlements of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, you're not really going to get the numbers. You can't just do it by firing government workers.
Okay, well, Bob, I mean, great discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, my pleasure, and thank you. It was a real pleasure to have a chance to talk with you and learn a little bit about your work.
Yeah.